"Get that device out of my aircraft right now." The words didn't slip out by accident. They were delivered like policy, loud, certain, and rehearsed. A 14-year-old boy excited for his first solo flight is publicly humiliated and dragged off a plane by a flight attendant who sees his science project as a threat. The crew, feeling victorious, prepares for takeoff unaware of the catastrophic mistake they just made. That boy's father, watching from a conference room overlooking the tarmac, just made a single phone call. In the next 60 seconds, every single flight for their airline across the entire country will be ordered to the ground by the one man who can do it. This isn't just bad service. It's a career-ending airline grounding-level disaster. The hum of New York's JFK International Airport was a familiar symphony to many, but today it felt different, especially for the boy who would soon find himself at the center of a national controversy. Not because he wanted to be there, but because someone decided he didn't belong. The weight of the Wilson atmospheric analyzer felt reassuring in Jamal Wilson's hands as he navigated the crowded terminal. At 14, he was flying unaccompanied for the first time a cross-country trip to Los Angeles to present his project at the National Youth Science Competition. The device was his pride and joy. A sophisticated arrangement of sensors, a small Raspberry Pi computer, and a GPS module all housed in a reinforced clear plastic casing that showcased rather than hid its complexity. To Jamal, it was a masterpiece. To anyone else unfamiliar with DIY electronics, it might look intimidating. He checked his boarding pass for Atlantic Global Airlines flight number 437 for the 10th time. Gate D12. He was early, just as his dad had instructed. "Be early, be polite. Text me when you board." His father's voice echoed in his mind, a steady anchor in the sea of anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. Jamal had always been quiet, thoughtful, more comfortable with circuitry and code than with crowds and conversation. His fingers traced the smooth edges of his device as he weighted a habit that calmed his nerves. This invention wasn't just a science project. It was a solution. Built for under $200, the Wilson Atmospheric Analyzer could collect precise meteorological data that usually required equipment costing thousands. His vision was to make weather prediction technology accessible to communities that couldn't afford expensive systems. "The atmosphere doesn't care about your zip code," his dad had said one night as they worked on the calibration, "but weather warnings sure seem to." Jamal smiled at the memory. 3 months ago, he'd nearly given up when the barometric sensor kept malfunctioning. It was his dad who stayed up with him until 2 a.m., patiently helping him troubleshoot until they discovered the solution, an elegant mathematical correction in the code that compensated for temperature variations. Science isn't about getting it right the first time, his father had told him. It's about not giving up until you do. Now, as Jamal watched planes take off through the terminal windows, he felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. This would be the first time he presented his work without his father nearby. But that was okay. Dr. Wilson had taught him well. "You know what you built," his father had said last night. "Don't let anyone make you doubt it." 3 floors above the main terminal, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the tarmac, Dr. Dominic Wilson was deep in discussion with a panel of aviation safety experts. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his field intimately. His voice, calm yet authoritative, commanded attention without demanding it. "The Wilson safety protocol isn't just about adding more checks," he explained, gesturing to the projection screen behind him. "It's about changing how we perceive risk assessment entirely." As the Federal Aviation Administration's leading expert on operational safety, Dr. Wilson had spent the last decade revolutionizing how airlines evaluated potential threats. His approach, now being implemented across U.S. airlines, emphasized objective criteria over subjective judgment, evidence over assumption. "We've found that 78% of false security alerts involve subjective assessments colored by personal bias," he continued. "When we remove that variable and rely on established criteria, we not only increase actual safety, but reduce discriminatory incidents by 64%. The room nodded in agreement. Doctor. Wilson's reputation preceded him. Harvard-educated with a doctorate in aviation safety management, he'd become the industry's North Star for balancing security with fairness. He glanced at his watch. He'd promised Jamal they would meet for a quick lunch before their respective flights, but this symposium had run longer than expected. He discreetly checked his phone, sending a quick message. Meeting running late. Might not make lunch. Remember everything we talked about. I'll see you from the tower. It was their inside joke. Jamal always imagined his dad watching flights from some mysterious control tower. In truth, Dominic worried about his son traveling alone. Not because Jamal couldn't handle it. The boy was remarkably self-sufficient, but because the world didn't always see what Dominic saw, a brilliant young mind with limitless potential. Too often, people saw only the color of his skin and made assumptions that could turn a routine flight into an ordeal. He'd prepared Jamal as best he could. Be polite. Be clear. Know your rights. But there was a weight to those instructions that no parent should have to place on a 14-year-old's shoulders. Refocusing on his presentation, Dominic pushed those concerns aside. Jamal was smart. He would be fine. Gate D12 buzzed with the controlled chaos of a boarding flight. Harried parents corralled excited children, business travelers typed furiously on laptops, and flight attendants prepared for another journey across the continent. Jamal stood patiently in line as the gate agent, Thomas Reynolds, a tired-looking man of about 45 with thinning hair and a permanent frown, called for first-class passengers and those needing special assistance. Then came the pre-boarding announcement for families with small children and unaccompanied minors. Jamal stepped forward, boarding pass and ID ready. Thomas barely looked up from his computer. "Boarding pass," he said flatly. Jamal handed it over. Thomas scanned it and the machine beeped. "Unaccompanied minor," Thomas announced, finally looking up. His gaze lingered on Jamal, taking in his dark skin, his slightly worn backpack, and his neat but simple clothing. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You know the rules," son Thomas said, his voice carrying a hint of unnecessary authority. "Stay in your seat. Don't disturb the crew or other passengers." "Yes, sir," Jamal replied quietly. "What's in the bag?" Thomas asked, nodding toward Jamal's backpack. "My clothes and my science project," Jamal answered. "For a competition in Los Angeles." Thomas looked skeptical but waved him through. "Seat 18B, middle seat." Jamal nodded and walked down the jet bridge, his heart thumping with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. This was it. His first solo flight, his first major science competition. The narrow aisle of the Boeing 737 felt like a gauntlet as Jamal made his way to row 18. He found his seat between a businessman already typing on his laptop and an older woman who eyed his backpack warily as he approached. "Excuse me," Jamal said politely. "I'm in the middle seat." The woman sighed, but moved to let him in. As Jamal settled, he carefully pulled his atmospheric analyzer from his backpack, placing it on his lap. He wanted to double-check the battery connections before stowing it under his seat for the flight. He was lost in his world, tightening a small thumb screw when he felt the atmosphere around him change. The woman beside him had inched closer to the window, creating as much distance as possible. The man on the aisle glanced over, his expression unreadable. Jamal worked quickly, aware of the growing discomfort around him. He didn't want to cause trouble. He just needed to make sure his project would survive the flight intact. "What is that?" Jamal looked up. A senior flight attendant, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun and her name tag reading Catherine Vickers, was staring at his device. Her smile was a thin painted line that didn't reach her eyes. "It's my science project," Jamal explained, his voice wavering slightly. "I'm just making sure it's off before I put it away. It's for a competition in Los Angeles." "I don't care what it's for," Catherine snapped, her voice cutting through the cabin noise. Several passengers turned to look. "It looks complicated. It's not approved. Put it away now." "Yes, ma'am." I am, Jamal said, his cheeks burning. He felt the eyes of the passengers around him, particularly the woman who was now pointedly leaning away from him. He quickly zipped the device back into his bag and slid it under the seat in front of him. All electronics, especially homemade ones, Catherine said, her voice laced with disdain, must be fully stowed. We have procedures for a reason. She watched him, her arms crossed until the bag was completely out of sight. She then turned and walked up the aisle, her heels clicking with authority. Jamal sank into his seat, the excitement of his first solo flight instantly evaporating, replaced by the hot sting of shame. He pulled out his phone and began to text his dad, boarded. Flight attendant was really mean about my project. She acted like it was dangerous. He stared at the message, then deleted the second and third sentences. His dad had enough to worry about with his symposium. Instead, he typed, boarded, seat 18B. Love you. A moment later, his dad replied, love you too, son. Have a great flight. I'm watching number 437 on the operations monitor right now. Talk to you when you land in LA. Jamal smiled, feeling a little better. He put his phone into airplane mode and settled in for the flight, trying to ignore the lingering, suspicious glances from the passenger beside him. The plane was full. The final doors were sealed and the cabin buzzed with the sound of settling passengers. Jamal tried to shrink himself to become invisible. He just wanted to get to LA to show his project to people who would understand it, who would see its value instead of viewing it with suspicion. Catherine Vickers was making her final pass through the cabin, her eyes scanning for seatbelts and upright tray tables. Her gaze landed on 18B and narrowed. She stopped, planting herself in the aisle. You? She said to Jamal, who startled at being addressed. I'm going to need to see that device again. But I put it away. Jamal stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. It's off. I promise. I don't care. Catherine said, her voice low and demanding. We don't know what it is. It could be a restricted item. I'm responsible for the safety of this cabin. It's not, Jamal insisted, feeling panic rising in his throat. It's for meteorology. It just reads air pressure and humidity. I can show you the paperwork for the competition. I am not going to argue with a child, Catherine said, her voice rising. Either you show me the device right now, or I will have you and your bag removed from this flight. The threat hung in the air, heavy and toxic. The passengers around them were now fully engaged. Some were filming with their phones, others muttering among themselves. What's the holdup? A man in the row behind complained. This kid has something in his bag, Catherine announced to the cabin as if rallying support. He's being non-compliant. I'm not. Jamal's voice cracked with panic. He was being accused publicly. I'll show you. I'll show you. His hands trembled as he reached under the seat and pulled out his backpack. He unzipped the main compartment and carefully lifted the atmospheric analyzer. Catherine recoiled as if he'd pulled out a snake. What is that? All those wires. Is that a timer? She demanded, pointing at the digital display. No, that's a Raspberry Pi. It's a computer, Jamal tried to explain, his words tumbling out. And that's a GPS module. It's for tracking its location when it's in the air. For my project. It's harmless. My dad helped me build it. He knows all about your dad. Catherine scoffed. And who is he? Let me guess. A janitor? Jamal's face flushed with a new kind of anger cutting through his fear. He's in aviation. Oh, I'm sure he is, Catherine said with a condescending smirk. Everyone's an expert. I'm calling the captain. She turned and marched toward the cockpit, leaving Jamal sitting frozen, his project on his lap, the focus of over 200 pairs of eyes. He felt like a criminal, exposed and vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced before. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder after Catherine left. Jamal sat motionless, his project still in his hands, afraid to move. Across the aisle, a woman in her early 30s with observant eyes and a press pass hanging from her bag watched the scene unfold with growing concern. Laura Bennett had been a journalist long enough to recognize injustice when she saw it. Near the front of the cabin, Miguel Ramirez, a junior flight attendant with kind eyes and a newly pressed uniform, had observed the entire interaction with mounting discomfort. At 29, he was still learning the ropes at Atlantic Global, but something about Catherine's approach struck him as excessive. He'd been trained that security concerns should be handled discreetly, not as public spectacles. "Is there a problem?" Miguel asked Catherine quietly as she brushed past him toward the cockpit. "That kid in 18B has some kind of homemade electronic device," she replied tersely. "Wires everywhere. Could be anything. I'm getting the captain involved." Miguel glanced back down the aisle at Jamal, seeing not a threat, but a terrified teenager holding what looked like a science fair project. He'd seen similar devices at his nephew's school. Simple computers with sensors attached. "Maybe I could take a look," Miguel suggested. "I know a bit about electronics." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my judgment?" "Ramirez, I've been flying since you were in grade school. I know a security risk when I see one." Miguel stepped back his training to respect senior crew members, overriding his instinct that something was wrong. "No, of course not. Just offering to help." Catherine rapped sharply on the cockpit door, then leaned in to speak with Captain Frank Morrison, a 58-year-old veteran pilot with salt and pepper hair and an unquestioning trust in his senior cabin crew. Meanwhile, Jamal felt the atmosphere in the cabin shifting around him. The businessman on the aisle seat had moved to create distance, while the woman by the window was now filming him surreptitiously. Other passengers were whispering, some pointing, others looking away uncomfortably. "It's just a weather instrument," Jamal said quietly to no one in particular, his voice barely audible over the cabin noise. "It measures atmospheric conditions." A few rows back, Mateo Gonzalez, a 63-year-old retired physics teacher with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, had been watching with growing concern. He recognized the components of Jamal's device. Nothing dangerous, just clever engineering. He considered speaking up, but hesitated, watching Catherine's return from the cockpit with a sense of foreboding. Jamal carefully placed his project back in his backpack, trying to make himself as small and non-threatening as possible. His mind raced. Should he call his dad? No. The plane was about to take off, and he'd been told to keep his phone in airplane mode. His father had always taught him to respect rules. Besides, this was probably just a misunderstanding. Once they saw the competition paperwork, they'd realize his device was harmless. As Catherine marched back down the aisle, her expression had hardened from suspicion to determination. Whatever conversation she'd had with the captain had only reinforced her position. Miguel followed a few steps behind, concern evident on his face. "Captain wants it off the plane," Catherine announced loudly, stopping at row 18. "Both it and you." "What?" Jamal's voice was barely a whisper. "But I have to get to Los Angeles. The competition starts tomorrow morning. You should have thought about that before bringing unauthorized equipment aboard," Catherine replied, her voice carrying through the cabin. "This isn't a school bus. This is a commercial aircraft with safety protocols." Jamal's hands trembled as he clutched his backpack. "Please, I can show you the invitation from the competition. It explains everything about my project. They're expecting me." Catherine's face remained impassive. "The decision has been made. We need you to gather your belongings and exit the aircraft." But Jamal started. "Is there really a need for this?" Laura Bennett spoke up from across the aisle, her journalist's instincts fully engaged. "The boy is clearly just carrying a science project." "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," Catherine snapped. "This is a security matter." From row 21, Mateo Gonzalez finally found his voice. "Excuse me," He called his accent reflecting his Mexican heritage. I'm a retired physics teacher. What the young man has is a basic atmospheric monitoring device. I've supervised dozens of similar projects. It's completely harmless. Catherine's eyes flashed with irritation. Sir, with all due respect, we have protocols to follow. The captain has made his decision based on my assessment. Your assessment, Mateo questioned. Based on what expertise in electronics or meteorological equipment? The cabin grew tense as more passengers began to take sides. Some nodded in agreement with Mateo, while others muttered about safety concerns and delays. Miguel stepped forward, trying to de-escalate. Perhaps we could have the device checked by ground security before. That's enough, Ramirez. Catherine cut him off sharply. You're still on probation. Don't forget that. Miguel fell silent, but his expression spoke volumes. He didn't agree with what was happening, but his job was on the line. Catherine turned back to Jamal. Last chance. Either you leave voluntarily, or I call security to remove you. Jamal looked around desperately, hoping for more support, but found mostly averted gazes. A few passengers were openly filming now, including Laura, whose phone was capturing every word. My dad Jamal began, his voice cracking. He works with the FAA. He'll explain everything. Can I just call him? Catherine's expression shifted to one of condescension. Oh, now your father works for the FAA First Aviation, now the Federal Aviation Administration. The stories keep changing, don't they? It's not a story, Jamal insisted, fighting back tears. It's true. His name is Dr. Dominic Wilson. He's at a symposium right now in this airport. The name didn't seem to register with Catherine, but Laura Bennett's eyes widened in recognition. She'd interviewed Dr. Wilson last year for a piece on aviation safety reforms. If your father is so important, Catherine said dismissively, then he can sort this out after you're off my plane. Right now, you're delaying our departure and inconveniencing everyone. She signaled toward the front of the plane where Thomas Reynolds, the gate agent, was now entering with 2 airport security officers. A burly white man in his late 30s with a shaved head, Officer Ryan Peterson, and a stern-looking woman in her early 40s, Officer Amanda Holt. That's him, Catherine said, pointing at Jamal as if he were a wanted felon. Seat 18B. He has a prohibited device and was non-compliant with crew instructions. The color drained from Jamal's face as the officers approached. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not when he'd done nothing wrong. Stand up, son, Officer Peterson commanded, his hand resting meaningfully on his belt. Bring your belongings and come with us. Please, Jamal whispered. It's just a science project. I can prove it. You can explain everything outside, Officer Holt said, her tone slightly less harsh but just as firm. Right now, you need to come with us. As Jamal stood, his legs felt like they might give way beneath him. He clutched his backpack protectively to his chest, terrified they might take it away or damage his project. This is outrageous, Laura Bennett said, standing now. I'm recording this entire interaction. This young man has done nothing wrong. Ma'am, unless you want to join him, I suggest you sit down and mind your own business, Officer Peterson warned. Mateo Gonzalez stood as well. This is discrimination, plain and simple. Would you be removing him if he were a white child with a science project? Sir, this is your final warning, Officer Peterson said, his hand now moving toward his radio. Interference with security procedures is a federal offense. Mateo reluctantly sat down, but not before saying loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, I will be a witness for this young man. This is wrong. Jamal was escorted up the aisle like a criminal, every eye in the cabin on him. Some passengers looked sympathetic, others suspicious, but most simply looked away, unwilling to get involved. As he reached the front of the plane, Miguel whispered, I'm sorry, kid, just loud enough for Jamal to hear. Catherine watched with grim satisfaction. Next time, leave your science experiments at home, she said as Jamal passed. The jetway felt a mile long as Jamal walked between the 2 officers, his dream of presenting at the competition crumbling with each step. As Jamal was led away, Laura Bennett quickly saved her recording and began a live stream on her social media channels. With over 500,000 followers from her work as an investigative journalist, focusing on social justice issues, she knew this incident would resonate. "I'm currently on Atlantic Global Flight 437 at JFK," she narrated quietly into her phone. "I've just witnessed a young black teenager removed from the plane for having a science project that a flight attendant deemed suspicious. No evaluation by anyone with technical knowledge was made. I'm going to follow this story and find out what happens next." She ended the stream, then quickly sent a text to her editor. Possible major story developing. African American teen removed from flight over science project. Will investigate further. Meanwhile, Mateo Gonzalez was not sitting idly by. He pulled out his tablet and began searching for information on the National Youth Science Competition in Los Angeles. Within minutes, he found the participant list, and there it was, Jamal Wilson. Wilson Atmospheric Analyzer, New York Science Academy. He took a screenshot, then stood up. "Excuse me," he called out to Miguel, who was helping prepare the cabin for departure. "I have proof the young man was telling the truth. He's registered for the competition." Miguel approached hesitantly, glancing toward the front where Catherine was speaking with another passenger. "I can't really do anything now. The decision's been made." "Then who can?" "This is wrong," Mateo insisted, showing Miguel his tablet. "Look, he's legitimate." Miguel looked troubled. "I'm sorry, sir. Maybe you can speak to someone at the gate." Across the aisle, the businessman who had been sitting next to Jamal finally spoke up. "That kid wasn't doing anything wrong. I build computers as a hobby." What he had was basic components, nothing dangerous. "Then why didn't you say something?" Laura challenged him. The man looked ashamed. I don't know. It all happened so fast." Back in the terminal, Jamal was being escorted to a secure area. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from his father. "About to wrap up here. Meet you at Starbucks near your gate in 20. Jamal's hands shook as he tried to reply. Officer Peterson noticed and barked, "No phone until we've completed processing." "Please," Jamal begged. "I need to tell my dad what's happening. He's in this airport right now." "You can call your parents after we've determined you're not a security threat," Officer Holt said, her tone slightly softer than her partner's. Laura Bennett had deplaned, claiming a sudden illness, and was now following at a distance, documenting everything on her phone. She recognized the security holding area they were headed to, the infamous gray room where passengers pulled for additional screening often waited for hours. As they approached the security area, Mateo Gonzalez also appeared in the terminal, having decided that following this injustice was more important than his trip. He spotted Laura and approached her. "Are you following this too?" he asked. "I'm a journalist," Laura explained. "This story needs to be told." "I'm a witness," Mateo replied. "That boy did nothing wrong. I taught physics for 35 years. What he had was a legitimate scientific instrument." "I believe you," Laura said. "I'm Laura Bennett from the Washington Post." "Mateo Gonzalez," he introduced himself. "Retired from Lincoln High School." "What can we do to help him?" Laura thought for a moment. "We need to find his father." He mentioned his name, Dr. Dominic Wilson with the FAA. Mateo's eyes widened. "Dr. Wilson, the aviation safety expert. I just read an article about his work last month." The same Laura confirmed. "If that boy is really his son, this situation is about to change dramatically." As they spoke, Miguel Ramirez exited the jet bridge looking troubled. He spotted them and hesitated, then seemed to make a decision and walked over. "I don't agree with what happened," he said quietly, "but I could lose my job if anyone sees me talking to you." "Sometimes doing the right thing comes with risks," Mateo said gently. "That boy needs help." Miguel nodded. They took him to secondary screening. "Room 5B. It's against protocol how this was handled. We're supposed to have TSA evaluate suspicious items on the jetway, not publicly accuse passengers." "Thank you," Laura said, already pulling up a contact on her phone. "This information helps. I never said that," Miguel replied, already walking away. "And I was never here." Laura's call connected. "Alex. It's Laura. I need you to find contact information for Dr. Dominic Wilson, FAA aviation safety expert. It's urgent. His son has just been detained at JFK on suspicion of carrying a dangerous device, which is actually just a science project." While Laura made her calls, Mateo started a new approach. He walked directly to the Atlantic Global Customer Service Desk. "I need to speak with your manager immediately," he said firmly. "There's been a serious mistake on Flight 437. Inside the gray room, a sterile, windowless space with harsh fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable metal chairs. Jamal sat alone except for Officer Peterson, who stood by the door with his arms crossed. His project had been placed on a metal table, looking alien and potentially threatening in this security context. "So want to tell me what this really is?" Officer Peterson asked, his tone making it clear he already had his suspicions. "It's an atmospheric analyzer," Jamal explained for what felt like the 100th time. "It measures temperature, humidity, air pressure, and particulate matter in the atmosphere. It's for a science competition." "Uh-huh," Peterson responded skeptically. "And what's this part?" He pointed to the GPS module. "That's a GPS tracker. It records the location where each measurement is taken." "And why would a kid need that?" Peterson pressed. "Planning on tracking something. Or someone." "No, sir." Jamal said, his patience wearing thin despite his fear. "It's so we can map the data geographically. Air quality changes based on location." "Take it apart," Peterson instructed suddenly. "What you heard me. If it's what you say it is, you should be able to disassemble it and explain each component." Jamal hesitated. The device had taken months to calibrate perfectly. Disassembling it might throw off its accuracy, and he didn't have time to recalibrate before the competition. "It's carefully calibrated," Jamal tried to explain. "If I take it apart." "Either you take it apart or we do," Peterson interrupted. "And we won't be careful about it." Fighting back tears of frustration, Jamal began to carefully disconnect the components, explaining each one as he went. "This is the Raspberry Pi. It's just a small computer. These are environmental sensors for measuring air quality. This is the barometric pressure sensor. This is the GPS module." Peterson watched with narrowed eyes, clearly understanding little of what Jamal was saying, but unwilling to admit it. Outside the room, Diane Lancaster, Atlantic Global's on-site manager, was having a heated conversation with the captain of Flight 437, which was still delayed at the gate. "Frank, we're already 20 minutes behind schedule," she said tersely into her phone. "Is this device actually dangerous or not?" Catherine said. "It looked suspicious," Captain Morrison replied defensively. "Better safe than sorry. We've got passengers threatening to file complaints, a journalist asking questions, and now some retired teacher claiming the kid is registered for a legitimate science competition," Lancaster snapped. "This better not turn into a PR nightmare." "Not my department," Morrison replied. "My concern is flight safety." "Just get your plane in the air," Lancaster said. "I'll handle the fallout here." As she hung up, Lancaster saw Laura Bennett approaching with determined strides. "Ms. Lancaster." Laura Bennett, Washington Post. "I'd like a statement about why Atlantic Global removed a 14-year-old scientist from his flight without proper evaluation of his science project." Lancaster's PR training kicked in immediately. "I'm afraid you have incomplete information, Ms. Bennett. A passenger was removed for further security screening following standard protocols. No determination about the passenger or their belongings has been made yet. Is it standard protocol to publicly humiliate a minor and accuse them of carrying dangerous materials before any proper inspection has been conducted?" Laura pressed. "I'm not going to comment on an ongoing security matter," Lancaster replied stiffly. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She turned away only to face Mateo Gonzalez. "Ms. Lancaster, I presume," he said. "I was on that flight. I witnessed everything. I've already submitted a formal complaint and contacted the competition organizers in Los Angeles. They're expecting this young man to present tomorrow." Lancaster's professional smile tightened. "Sir, we take all passenger concerns seriously, but safety must remain our top priority." Meanwhile, Miguel had made his own move. Using the crew computer terminal, he had looked up Dr. Dominic Wilson and discovered he was indeed scheduled to speak at the Aviation Safety Symposium in Terminal 4. After a moment of hesitation, Miguel sent a message to a friend in airport operations. "Need urgent help. Fortoyo, son of Dr. Wilson, FAA, detained at security holding room 5B. Removed from number 437 over science project. Situation handled badly. May want to intervene before this explodes." Inside the gray room, Jamal had finished disassembling his project. Components were spread across the table, looking far less threatening individually than they had assembled. "See," Jamal said, his voice steadier now that he was talking about the science. "It's just sensors and a small computer. Nothing dangerous." Officer Peterson still looked unconvinced, but Officer Holt, who had returned to the room, seemed to be reassessing the situation. "Ryan, this looks like a science project to me," she said quietly. "Maybe we should—" The door opened and Diane Lancaster entered, her expression carefully neutral. "What's the status here? Still evaluating the device," Peterson replied. Lancaster looked at the disassembled components and then at Jamal. For the first time, she seemed to really see him. A frightened teenager surrounded by adults who had already decided he was guilty of something. Her instinct for self-preservation kicked in. This could get messy. Better to resolve it quickly. "Young man," she said, adopting a gentler tone, "I understand there's been a misunderstanding. Your device appears to be what you claimed. A science project. Atlantic Global Airlines regrets any inconvenience." Jamal looked up, hope flickering. "So I can get back on the plane." "I'm afraid your flight has already departed," Lancaster said. "But we'll be happy to book you on the next available flight to Los Angeles, with our compliments, of course." "But I need to be there tonight," Jamal said desperately. "Registration closes at 8 p.m. "We'll do our best," Lancaster said noncommittally. "Now, if you'll just sign this form acknowledging that we conducted a routine security check." She placed a document in front of him, a standard liability waiver that would absolve the airline of any wrongdoing. Jamal stared at it, something his father had told him echoing in his mind. Never sign anything without reading it completely, especially if someone's rushing you. "I'd like to call my father first," Jamal said firmly, surprising himself with his steadiness. "He's in this airport right now." "That won't be necessary," Lancaster began, but was interrupted by a commotion outside. The door burst open and Dr. Dominic Wilson stood in the threshold, his normally calm demeanor replaced by controlled fury. Behind him stood a small crowd. Laura Bennett, with her phone still recording Mateo Gonzalez, looking relieved, and several FAA officials from the symposium. Dad Jamal cried, his composure finally breaking. Dr. Wilson crossed the room in 3 strides and embraced his son. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "They made me take apart my project," Jamal said, gesturing to the components scattered across the table. Dr. Wilson surveyed the disassembled device, then turned to face the room, his arm still protectively around Jamal's shoulders. "Would someone like to explain?" he said, his voice deceptively quiet. "Why my son was removed from his flight and detained as a security threat for carrying a science project to a national competition." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The fluorescent lights of the security holding room cast harsh shadows across every face as Dr. Wilson's question hung in the air. Officer Peterson, who had been so confident minutes before, now shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden change in power dynamics, but not fully grasping its extent. "Sir, we were simply following standard protocols for suspicious devices." He began, his authoritative tone slightly diminished. "Suspicious devices, Doctor," Wilson echoed, looking pointedly at the disassembled components on the metal table. "What you see before you is a Wilson atmospheric analyzer designed to collect meteorological data for communities that can't afford expensive weather monitoring systems. It contains sensors, a basic computer, and a GPS module. Nothing more." He turned to Jamal, his voice softening. "Are you okay, son?" Jamal nodded, still shaken but finding strength in his father's presence. "They wouldn't listen, Dad." I tried to explain. "I know," Dr. Wilson said, squeezing his shoulder gently before turning back to the room. His eyes locked on Diane Lancaster. "You are Diane Lancaster, on-site manager for Atlantic Global Airlines," she replied, extending her hand, which Dr. Wilson pointedly did not take. "Ms. Lancaster, I'd like to understand the chain of events that led to my son being treated like a criminal," Dr. Wilson said, his calm voice belying the anger evident in his rigid posture. Lancaster's professional mask slipped slightly. "Dr. Wilson, I assure you Atlantic Global takes these matters very seriously. There appears to have been a misunderstanding, and we're prepared to offer compensation in the form of—" "I'm not interested in compensation," Dr. Wilson interrupted. "I'm interested in accountability. Who made the initial determination that my son's science project was a security threat?" Before Lancaster could answer, Laura Bennett spoke from the doorway. "It was a flight attendant named Catherine Vickers. I have the entire interaction recorded." Dr. Wilson nodded to her. "Ms. Bennett, isn't it? I believe we've met." "Yes, at the Aviation Safety Conference last year," Laura confirmed. "I'm sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances." "As am I," Dr. Wilson replied before turning back to Lancaster. "I want to see Ms. Vickers and the captain who authorized this action. Immediately. They're in the air now, Doctor." Wilson Lancaster explained, an edge of defensiveness in her voice. "Flight 437 departed 20 minutes ago. Then bring them back," Dr. Wilson said simply. Lancaster laughed, a short, nervous sound. "That's not possible. We can't recall a flight that's already departed." "Actually, you can," one of the FAA officials behind Dr. Wilson interjected. "Under certain circumstances." Lancaster's smile froze. "This hardly constitutes an emergency that would warrant—" "What it constitutes," Dr. Wilson said, his voice dropping dangerously low, "is a textbook case of discriminatory security assessment. My son was profiled, publicly humiliated, and removed from a flight because a flight attendant with no technical expertise deemed his science project suspicious. At no point was anyone with relevant knowledge consulted." He gestured to Jamal's disassembled project. "Look at what they made him do. Months of careful calibration potentially ruined because no one bothered to follow proper evaluation protocols." Officer Holt, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. "Dr. Wilson, for what it's worth, I was beginning to think this wasn't a genuine security concern myself. The way it was handled wasn't by the book." "Thank you for your honesty," Dr. Wilson acknowledged before turning back to Lancaster. "Ms. Lancaster, I'm not just Jamal's father. I'm also the Federal Aviation Administration's Chief of Operational Safety Standards. The protocols your airline ignored today, I wrote them." The color drained from Lancaster's face as the full implications sank in. "Now," Dr. Wilson continued, "here's what's going to happen. My son is going to carefully reassemble his project. You are going to arrange immediate transportation for him to Los Angeles in time for his competition. And I am going to review every security incident reported by Atlantic Global Airlines in the past year to determine if this is an isolated incident or a pattern of behavior." As Jamal carefully began reconnecting the components of his device, his hands still trembling slightly, Mateo Gonzalez approached the table. "May I help?" he offered gently. "I taught physics for 35 years. I recognize this design. It's quite impressive." Jamal looked up gratefully. "Yes, please." The calibration is tricky. As they worked together, Jamal felt a strange mixture of emotions. The lingering humiliation and fear, but also a growing anger and determination. He'd done nothing wrong. He'd followed every rule. Yet he'd been treated like a criminal because of how he looked and assumptions made about a device they didn't understand. It reminded him of an incident last year at school when a substitute teacher had accused him of cheating because his science test score was too high. His father had taught him then that sometimes the world wouldn't see his brilliance. They would only see his skin. You'll have to work twice as hard for half the credit, he'd said. It's not fair, but it's reality. The question is, what will you do with that reality? Looking at his father now, standing firm against a system that had wronged them, Jamal knew the answer. You didn't run from it. You didn't accept it. You changed it. Captain Frank Morrison was 37,000 feet above Pennsylvania when the secure line in the cockpit rang. He exchanged a puzzled glance with his co-pilot before answering. "This is Captain Morrison. Captain, this is Robert Davidson, Atlantic Global CEO." The voice was tense, urgent, not the usual tone of the company's chief executive. Sir Morrison responded immediately alert. Davidson never called flights in progress unless something was seriously wrong. "I need you to divert to Pittsburgh immediately," Davidson ordered without preamble. "Pittsburgh," Morrison repeated, baffled. "Sir, we're on course to Los Angeles with no mechanical issues. What's the nature of the emergency?" There was a pause before Davidson replied. "The emergency, Captain, is that you authorize the removal of Dr. Dominic Wilson's son from your aircraft based on a racially biased security assessment, and now the FAA is threatening to ground our entire airline for violation of proper security protocols." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "Wilson, as in the FAA's Chief of Operational Safety Standards?" "Yes," Davidson confirmed grimly. "The teenager your senior flight attendant accused of carrying a suspicious device, that was his son traveling to a national science competition with a project Dr. Wilson helped him build." Cold sweat broke out on Morrison's forehead as the implications sank in. Sir Catherine Vickers reported a potentially suspicious device. "I was following protocol by failing to have qualified personnel evaluate the device, by allowing a minor to be publicly accused and removed without proper assessment." Davidson interrupted, his voice sharp. "That's not protocol, Morrison. That's negligence at best, discrimination at worst." "Sir, I divert to Pittsburgh," Davidson repeated. "You, Vickers, and the entire crew will remain there while we sort this out. I'm sending another crew to continue the flight to LA." After disconnecting, Morrison sat in stunned silence for a moment before turning to his co-pilot. "Set course for Pittsburgh," he said quietly. "We're being recalled." Meanwhile, back at JFK, the situation was escalating rapidly. Atlantic Global's executive offices had erupted into crisis mode when they received word that Dr. Wilson was invoking Emergency Protocol 89C, a little-used FAA regulation that allowed for immediate safety culture review with potential flight suspension. In a hastily assembled conference call, Davidson was trying to contain the damage. "What exactly is Wilson threatening?" he demanded. Diane Lancaster, now back in her office, responded, "He's conducting an emergency review of our security assessment procedures, claiming we demonstrated catastrophic judgment failure that endangers every passenger. Can he actually ground our flights?" another executive asked. "In theory, yes," Lancaster admitted. Emergency Protocol 89C gives the FAA authority to suspend operations pending safety culture review if there's evidence of structural failures in judgment. Dr. Wilson is saying that what happened to his son demonstrates exactly that. This is outrageous." Davidson exploded. "We can't have our entire operation shut down because one flight attendant was overzealous." "It's more than that," Lancaster said grimly. "Ms. Bennett, the journalist who witnessed everything, has already published a preliminary report online. It's gaining traction. Hashtags like #Justice4. Jamal and #flying while black are trending, and Dr. Wilson has evidence suggesting this isn't an isolated incident. What evidence? Davidson demanded. Apparently, a Hispanic flight attendant named Miguel Ramirez has been documenting incidents of potential profiling for months. He's turned over his records to Dr. Wilson. Davidson was silent for a moment. Then, get me a helicopter to JFK. Now. Back in the terminal, Catherine Vickers and the rest of the Flight 437 crew had just landed in Pittsburgh to a reception of grim-faced airline officials. As they were escorted to a private room, Catherine turned to Miguel. "What's happening?" she asked, genuine worry cracking her usually confident demeanor. Miguel couldn't meet her eyes. "The boy you had removed. His father is Dr. Dominic Wilson." "Who?" Catherine asked the name, meaning nothing to her. "Only the most influential safety expert at the FAA." Captain Morrison interjected, his voice tight with anger. "The man who literally wrote the book on airline safety protocols. The man who now has the power to ground our entire airline because of how we handled his son." The color drained from Catherine's face as she finally understood the magnitude of her actions. But the device looked suspicious. She insisted, though her voice lacked conviction now. "I was protecting the flight." "No," Miguel said quietly but firmly. "You saw a black teenager with something you didn't understand and you assumed the worst. That's not protection. That's prejudice." Catherine stared at him speechless for perhaps the first time in her career. Dr. Dominic Wilson stood in the executive conference room of Atlantic Global Airlines at JFK, his presence commanding attention despite the chaos unfolding around him. Large monitors on the wall displayed flight statuses, many now flashing with delay notifications as the airline scrambled to respond to the crisis. Jamal sat nearby, his project now reassembled, but his expression still troubled. Mateo Gonzalez had stayed with him, offering both technical assistance and moral support. Laura Bennett was outside the room, continuously updating her developing story, which had already been picked up by major news outlets. The door burst open and Robert Davidson strode in, still wearing the casual golf attire he'd had on when the crisis erupted. His face was flushed, whether from hurry or anger was unclear. "Dr. Wilson," he began without preamble. "I understand you're upset, but grounding an entire airline over one incident is extreme and irresponsible." Dr. Wilson regarded him calmly. "Mr. Davidson, I've been reviewing Atlantic Global's security incident reports for the past 6 months. This is far from one incident. Your airline has a pattern of disproportionately targeting passengers of color for additional screening and removal. That's a serious accusation." Davidson bristled. "It's not an accusation, it's data," Dr. Wilson replied, sliding a tablet across the conference table. 47% of your security removals involve passengers of color, despite them making up only 18% of your customer base. That's not coincidence. That's bias affecting safety decisions. Davidson glanced at the figures, his expression faltering slightly. "These statistics can be interpreted in multiple ways. Indeed they can," Dr. Wilson agreed. "Which is why I've brought in FAA statistical analysts to review them thoroughly. But the incident with my son isn't about statistics. It's about a fundamental failure in your safety culture." He walked to the window overlooking the tarmac where Atlantic Global planes sat at their gates, passengers increasingly frustrated by unexplained delays. "Mr. Davidson, I'm not grounding your airline because my son was mistreated, though. That would be reason enough for me as a father," Dr. Wilson said, turning back to face him. "I'm initiating Emergency Protocol 89C because your crew demonstrated a catastrophic failure of judgment that endangers every passenger who flies with you." Davidson's professional mask slipped further. "How does removing a suspicious device endanger passengers?" "Because it wasn't suspicious, and it wasn't a threat," Dr. Wilson answered sharply. "It was assessed as suspicious by someone with no technical expertise who made assumptions based on appearances. That same flawed judgment could just as easily miss a real threat or waste resources on perceived threats that don't exist. He gestured to Jamal's device on the table. My son spent 6 months building an atmospheric analyzer that could provide early weather warnings to communities that can't afford expensive meteorological equipment. Your flight attendant took one look at it, and him, and saw a threat. That's not just bad for my son. It's dangerous for aviation safety as a whole. The room fell silent as Davidson seemed to finally grasp the severity of the situation. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "Accountability," Dr. Wilson replied without hesitation. "Not just token measures or PR statements. Real structural change in how your airline assesses risk and treats passengers." As they spoke, Sofia Rivera, a 36-year-old Hispanic woman who had worked for Atlantic Global for over a decade, was being escorted into the conference room by an FAA official. She carried a thick folder of documents and looked both nervous and determined. "This is Ms. Rivera," Dr. Wilson said. "She's been documenting discriminatory incidents within your airline for 3 years. Her reports to management were consistently ignored or dismissed." Davidson's eyes narrowed. "I've never heard of these reports." Precisely the problem, Dr. Wilson said. "They never made it past middle management because your company culture dismisses these concerns as irrelevant to operations. I'm here to tell you they're central to operations." The tension in the room was palpable when Caroline Matthews, the FAA director, joined the call on the main screen. At 55, she had a reputation for fairness and unwavering commitment to aviation safety. "Robert." She greeted Davidson with a curt nod. "I've reviewed Dr. Wilson's preliminary findings. The situation is serious enough to warrant immediate intervention." Davidson's face tightened. "Caroline, surely we can resolve this without Atlantic Global flights will remain grounded until we've conducted a thorough review of your security assessment procedures," Matthews interrupted firmly. "This isn't negotiable." As the implications of a full grounding sank in, Davidson's business instincts finally overcame his defensiveness. "What are the conditions for lifting the suspension?" he asked, his voice strained but practical. Dr. Wilson stepped forward. "Complete retraining of all staff on objective threat assessment. Implementation of the Wilson Protocol for security evaluations. Third-party auditing of all security incidents for at least 1 year. And a formal apology to my son, not for PR purposes, but as an acknowledgement that what happened today was wrong." Davidson looked from Dr. Wilson to Jamal, seeing not just an angry father and humiliated son, but the future of his airline hanging in the balance. "And if we agree to these terms?" he asked quietly. "Then Atlantic Global has the opportunity to become a leader in fair and effective security practices," Dr. Wilson replied. "This isn't about punishment, Mr. Davidson. It's about improvement." For a moment, Davidson seemed to be calculating costs and benefits in his head. Then, with a slight slump of his shoulders, he nodded. "Dr. Wilson," he said formally on behalf of Atlantic Global Airlines. "I apologize to your son for the inexcusable treatment he received today, and I commit to implementing all requested changes effective immediately." Jamal, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Does this mean other kids like me won't have to go through what I did?" Davidson looked at the teenager, really seeing him for the first time. "Yes," he said simply. "That's exactly what it means." The tension in the conference room was thick enough to cut with a knife as Dr. Wilson prepared to make the call that would determine Atlantic Global's immediate future. His finger hovered over the speakerphone button, his expression unreadable. "Before I do this," he said, looking directly at Davidson, "I want to be absolutely clear about why this is happening. This isn't retribution. This isn't about my son. Though what happened to him was inexcusable. This is about a fundamental safety issue that affects every passenger who boards one of your aircraft." Davidson, now fully grasping the severity of the situation, nodded slowly. "I understand." Dr. Wilson pressed the button and Caroline Matthews' voice filled the room. Wilson, what's your assessment? Atlantic Global has demonstrated a structural failure in their security assessment procedures, Dr. Wilson stated formally. The incident today with my son is merely the most recent example of a pattern where subjective bias overrides objective safety protocols. Under Emergency Protocol 89-C, I'm recommending immediate suspension of operations pending comprehensive review and reform. There was a brief silence before Matthews responded. Documentation received and reviewed. Based on your assessment and the supporting evidence, I'm authorizing implementation of Emergency Protocol 89-C, effective immediately. All Atlantic Global flights currently on the ground are to remain so. Aircraft in the air will continue to their destinations, but will not be cleared for return flights. Davidson closed his eyes briefly, the financial implications washing over him like a cold wave. Robert Matthews continued. I expect your full cooperation. This isn't punitive. It's corrective. Understood. Understood, Davidson replied. His voice strained but professional. As the call ended, the room erupted into controlled chaos. Airline executives rushed to contact operations centers and coordinate the unprecedented grounding. Public relations staff huddled in corners, frantically drafting statements. Legal advisors whispered urgently about liability and regulatory compliance. Amidst it all, Jamal sat quietly watching his father. There was no triumph in Dr. Wilson's expression, no satisfaction, only a solemn determination that Jamal recognized from the many times he'd seen his father tackle difficult problems. Dad, Jamal said softly, is this really happening because of me? Dr. Wilson sat beside his son, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. No, Jamal. This is happening because a system failed. Not just you, but potentially every passenger. What happened to you was a symptom of a larger problem. Sometimes it takes an incident like this to force necessary change. Across the room, Diane Lancaster approached hesitantly. Dr. Wilson, we're arranging a private flight for Jamal to Los Angeles. He'll arrive in plenty of time for the competition registration. Thank you, Dr. Wilson acknowledged, then turned back to Jamal. What do you think, son? Are you still up for the competition after all this? Jamal looked down at his reassembled project, then back at his father with newfound determination in his eyes. Yes, definitely. I didn't come this far to give up now. A slight smile touched Dr. Wilson's lips, the first since the ordeal began. That's my boy. As they spoke, the first waves of the grounding were rippling across the country. At gates throughout JFK and dozens of other airports, Atlantic Global staff were making announcements that sent groans and angry mutters through waiting areas. Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that Atlantic Global Airlines has been ordered to temporarily suspend operations due to a safety protocol review. All flights are currently delayed until further notice. In the conference room, one of the large monitors showed a news channel that had picked up the story. Laura Bennett's initial report had gone viral with footage of Jamal being escorted off the plane, playing on screens nationwide. The ticker at the bottom read, FAA grounds Atlantic Global Airlines after discriminatory incident involving teen scientist. Davidson watched the coverage grimly, then turned to Dr. Wilson. This is going to cost us millions. Probably Dr. Wilson agreed calmly. But how much has your current approach already cost? Not just in legal settlements for discrimination claims, but in talent you've lost, perspectives you've missed, and trust you've eroded. He gestured towards Sofia Rivera, who was now working with FAA officials to document the incidents she'd reported over the years. Ms. Rivera tried to help you fix this problem 3 years ago. If you had listened, then we wouldn't be here now. Davidson had no response to that. Meanwhile, in Pittsburgh, Catherine Vickers watched in stunned disbelief as television monitors in the airport lounge displayed news of the grounding, her name now mentioned specifically in reports. "This can't be happening," she whispered, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. Miguel Ramirez, sitting several seats away, looked at her without sympathy. "It didn't have to happen," he said quietly. "All you had to do was listen." Back at JFK, preparations for Jamal's flight to Los Angeles were being finalized. As Dr. Wilson helped gather Jamal's belongings, Mateo Gonzalez approached them. "Jamal," he said warmly, "I want you to have something." He handed over a business card. "That's my contact information. I've been teaching physics for over 3 decades, and I've rarely seen a project with as much potential as yours. When you get back from the competition, I'd like to introduce you to some colleagues at Columbia University who might be interested in helping develop your device further." Jamal's eyes widened. "Really? That would be amazing." "You have a gift," Mateo said simply. "Today, people tried to make you doubt that. Never let them." As Jamal was escorted to his flight, Dr. Wilson remained behind to oversee the initial stages of the protocol implementation. Davidson approached him one last time. "You know you could have handled this differently," the CEO said, a hint of resentment still in his voice. A private conversation, a formal complaint. There were options that didn't involve grounding an entire airline. Dr. Wilson looked at him steadily. "Mr. Davidson, for decades, people of color have filed private complaints, had polite conversations, and submitted formal reports about experiences like my son's. The result? More of the same. Sometimes the only way to create real change is to make the cost of maintaining the status quo too high to bear." He turned to leave, then paused. "Your airline isn't being punished. It's being given an opportunity to become better. What you do with that opportunity is up to you." As Dr. Wilson walked away, the weight of his words hung in the air, leaving Davidson to contemplate a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Chaos erupted across the country as the effects of Emergency Protocol 89C rippled through the aviation network. At Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson, passengers crowded around gate agents demanding explanations. In Chicago's O'Hare, business travelers frantically rebooked on competitor airlines as their Atlantic Global flights displayed "canceled," FAA order in bold red letters on departure boards. In Atlantic Global's Operations Center, controllers scrambled to manage the unprecedented situation. Dozens of aircraft already in the air would continue to their destinations, but hundreds more were now grounded indefinitely. The financial bleeding had begun. Every minute of the shutdown represented thousands in lost revenue. "How long will this last?" demanded Edward Thompson, the airline's chief of operations, as he paced the control room floor. "Unknown," replied a harried-looking coordinator. "The FAA directive simply states pending completion of safety culture review and implementation of remedial measures." "That could be days." Thompson exploded. "We can't stay grounded for days." At Pittsburgh International, Catherine Vickers sat in a private room, her hands shaking as she read the official notice of suspension pending investigation. After 24 years as a flight attendant, her career had effectively ended in a single disastrous decision. Captain Morrison wasn't faring much better. As the pilot who had authorized Jamal's removal without proper assessment, he was facing serious questions about his judgment and adherence to protocol. His previously spotless record now had a stain that might prove impossible to remove. "I trusted my senior crew member's assessment," he said weakly to the airline representative debriefing him. "And that's precisely the problem," the representative replied. "Protocol requires objective evaluation, not subjective trust." Miguel Ramirez, meanwhile, was being questioned in a separate room, not as a subject of investigation, but as a key witness. His documentation of previous incidents had become central to the FAA's case for implementing Emergency Protocol 89C. "How long have you been tracking these incidents?" asked the FAA investigator. "Almost 2 years," Miguel replied. "At first, I thought maybe I was being oversensitive, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. And you reported these concerns to management? Miguel nodded grimly. Multiple times. I was told to focus on my job and leave policy matters to those above my pay grade. Back at JFK, news vans had begun to arrive, setting up outside the terminal as the story gained national attention. Headlines flashed across screens nationwide. FAA grounds major airline after racial profiling incident. Teen scientist removed from flight over project. Airline pays steep price. Atlantic global shutdown. Thousands stranded as bias controversy erupts. Social media exploded with reactions. Hashtags like #justice for Jamal and #flying, while black trended worldwide. Videos of Jamal being escorted off the plane had been viewed millions of times, with commenters expressing outrage at his treatment. Laura Bennett's initial report had evolved into a comprehensive piece, highlighting not just Jamal's experience, but the broader pattern of incidents documented by Sofia Rivera and others. Her article included expert commentary on the psychological impact of such experiences on young people of color. What message does it send to brilliant young minds when their innovations are treated as threats simply because of who created them? Wrote Dr. Alicia Johnson, a prominent psychologist quoted in Bennett's piece. The damage extends far beyond one incident. As the story spread past, passengers began coming forward with their own experiences on Atlantic global flights. A black executive who'd been moved from first class despite having a valid ticket. A Middle Eastern physics professor questioned about his scientific calculator. A Hispanic family separated during boarding for additional screening that never materialized. The pattern that Dr. Wilson had identified through data was now being illustrated through dozens of personal stories, creating a damning narrative that Atlantic Global's PR team struggled to counter. At the corporate headquarters, Davidson had assembled his crisis management team. The initial shock had given way to pragmatic damage control. "We need to get ahead of this," Davidson said, his golf attire now replaced by a somber business suit. "Draft a statement acknowledging the concerns and committing to comprehensive reform." "Should we dispute the FAA's action?" asked the legal counsel. Davidson shook his head. "No, fighting this will only make us look worse. We comply, fully implement the changes quickly, and focus on getting our planes back in the air." He paused, looking at the executives around the table. "And we need to mean it. No token measures. This isn't just about PR anymore. This is about survival." The video had 3 million views before Jamal's private flight even touched down in Los Angeles. Laura Bennett's footage showing the 14-year-old scientist being escorted off Flight 437 while trying to explain his project had struck a chord that resonated far beyond aviation circles. It wasn't just another incident of discrimination. It was a visual representation of potential stifled innovation dismissed and youth disrespected. By morning, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet. Morning shows featured panels discussing not just the incident itself, but the broader implications for science education, racial equity in STEM fields, and the role of authority figures in either nurturing or suppressing young talent. "What troubles me most," said Dr. Neil Matthews, a prominent physicist interviewed on National Morning, "is not just the humiliation this young man endured, but how many other brilliant minds we've lost because they were treated with suspicion instead of support. How many potential cures, innovations, or solutions have we missed because we couldn't see past our biases?" In response to the overwhelming public interest, Atlantic Global issued a formal statement. Atlantic Global Airlines acknowledges with deep regret the treatment experienced by Jamal Wilson on our flight yesterday. We are cooperating fully with the FAA investigation and are committed to implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. We have reached out to the Wilson family to offer our sincere apologies and are taking immediate steps to address the structural issues that allowed this incident to occur. The statement, while professional, did little to stem the tide of public outrage. Comment sections and social media posts overflowed with personal stories of discrimination in travel, creating a growing sense that Jamal's experience, while extreme, was far from unique. Scientific and educational communities rallied particularly strongly around Jamal. The American Association for the Advancement of Science issued a statement condemning the criminalization of scientific curiosity in young people of color. The National Science Teachers Association announced a new initiative to support young inventors from underrepresented groups. Even competing airlines recognized the gravity of the situation. Delta's CEO made a public statement affirming their commitment to objective security assessments, while Southwest launched a Young Innovators Welcome campaign within hours of the story breaking. Laura Bennett, whose career had focused on exposing structural inequities, found herself at the center of a story bigger than she had anticipated. Her phone rang constantly with requests for interviews and follow-up information. "This resonates because it's so visual, so clear-cut," she explained to a colleague. "People can see themselves or their children in Jamal. They can imagine the humiliation, the frustration of creating something meaningful only to have it treated as suspicious." Meanwhile, Mateo Gonzalez had become an unexpected voice in the conversation. His perspective as both a retired physics teacher and an eyewitness to the incident made him a valuable commentator. In interviews, he emphasized not just the injustice, but the scientific merit of Jamal's project. "What I saw wasn't just discrimination," he told reporters. "It was scientific ignorance intersecting with bias. Anyone with basic knowledge of meteorological equipment would have recognized this device for what it was, an innovative approach to democratizing weather data." His endorsement of Jamal's project helped shift the narrative from solely focusing on the injustice to also celebrating the innovation that had been nearly suppressed. As public support for Jamal grew, a different kind of response emerged among some Atlantic Global employees. Anonymous sources within the company began speaking to journalists about a culture that prioritized efficiency over equity, where raising concerns about discriminatory practices was seen as creating unnecessary trouble. "There's an unspoken understanding," said one flight attendant who requested anonymity, "that certain passengers get more scrutiny than others. It's never in our training materials, never explicitly stated, but it's in the air we breathe." Another revealed that Catherine Vickers had a history of similar incidents that had gone unaddressed by management. This wasn't her first time, the source claimed. Just her first time targeting someone with the power to fight back. By evening, a crowdfunding campaign had been established to support young scientists facing barriers to their education. Named the Jamal Wilson Innovation Fund, it had raised over $75,000 in just 4 hours, with donors leaving messages of encouragement for Jamal and other young inventors. The conversation had transcended the specific incident, becoming a national reflection on whose innovations are celebrated and whose are suspected, whose curiosity is nurtured and whose is policed. As Jamal prepared for the competition the next day, largely sheltered from the media storm by competition organizers, he remained unaware of just how far-reaching the impact of his experience had become. The executive lounge at Los Angeles International Airport had been hastily converted into a makeshift conference room. Security guards ensured privacy as Robert Davidson, having flown across the country on a competitor airline, prepared to face Dr. Wilson and Jamal in person. The atmosphere was tense as Davidson entered, accompanied by Atlantic Global's chief legal officer and head of public relations. Dr. Wilson sat calmly at the table, Jamal beside him, the Wilson atmospheric analyzer placed carefully between them, a physical reminder of what had precipitated this crisis. "Thank you for agreeing to meet Davidson," began his voice, carefully modulated to project sincerity. "I wanted to personally express my regret for what happened and discuss how we move forward." Dr. Wilson's expression remained neutral. "I appreciate you making the trip, Mr. Davidson. Before we discuss anything else, I believe you have something to say to my son." Davidson turned to Jamal, the rehearsed apology suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of the teenager's steady gaze. "Jamal," he said, abandoning his prepared statement for something more genuine. "What happened to you on our aircraft was wrong. Not just procedurally wrong, but fundamentally wrong. You created something innovative and important, and instead of being recognized for your brilliance, you were treated with suspicion and disrespect. For that, I am truly sorry." Jamal nodded, accepting the apology with a maturity beyond his years. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Your device." Davidson continued gesturing to the atmospheric analyzer. "It's remarkable. I've been reading about it. The potential applications for communities without access to expensive weather monitoring systems. It's exactly the kind of innovation we should be celebrating." "That's what I've been trying to explain." Jamal said, his voice gaining confidence. "It's not just a science project. It's a solution for places that can't afford traditional meteorological equipment." Dr. Wilson watched this exchange with quiet pride before steering the conversation back to business. "Mr. Davidson, while your personal apology is appreciated, we're here to discuss substantial changes to Atlantic Global's practices." Davidson nodded gravely. "I understand. The FAA has outlined the requirements for lifting the grounding order, and we're prepared to comply fully." "Beyond compliance," Dr. Wilson pressed, "I want to ensure this isn't just a crisis management exercise that fades once the media attention dies down." At this point, the door opened, and Sofia Rivera entered. Davidson's expression registered surprise. He clearly hadn't expected her presence at this meeting. "Ms. Rivera will be joining us," Dr. Wilson explained. "As someone who has documented discriminatory incidents within your airline for years, her insights are invaluable to this discussion." Davidson shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "Of course." Sophia sat down, opening a folder of documents. "Mr. Davidson, I've worked for Atlantic Global for 11 years. In that time, I've filed 27 reports of concerning incidents involving discriminatory treatment of passengers and staff. Until yesterday, not one received meaningful attention from upper management." She slid several papers across the table. Internal memos, passenger complaints, and her own detailed documentation. "This isn't about a single flight attendant or captain making a bad call," she continued. "This is about a culture that normalizes treating certain passengers differently based on how they look rather than objective risk factors." Davidson reviewed the documents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Some of the incidents had occurred on flights he himself had authorized, yet they had never reached his desk as significant concerns. "I wasn't aware of the extent of this," he admitted finally. "That in itself is part of the problem," Dr. Wilson pointed out. These reports were being filtered out before they reached the level where real change could be implemented. The meeting continued for hours, delving into specific policy changes, training protocols, and accountability mechanisms. By the time they emerged, a comprehensive reform plan had been outlined, one that went beyond the FAA's minimum requirements. The plan included complete retraining of all staff on objective threat assessment, implementation of the Wilson Protocol for security evaluations, an independent review board for security incidents, promotion of more diverse leadership within the company, regular bias audits conducted by third-party experts, a scholarship program for young STEM innovators from underrepresented communities. As the meeting concluded, Davidson turned once more to Jamal. "Your experience has forced us to confront issues we should have addressed long ago. I can't undo what happened, but I can promise you it will lead to real change." Jamal considered this, then asked a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "What about Catherine Vickers and Captain Morrison? What happens to them?" Davidson glanced at his legal counsel before answering. "They've been suspended pending a full investigation. Their future with the company will depend on their willingness to acknowledge their actions and commit to change." "They shouldn't just be fired and forgotten," Jamal said thoughtfully. "That wouldn't solve anything. They need to understand why what they did was wrong. Dr. Wilson smiled slightly at his son's insight. Punishment without education rarely led to lasting change. As they prepared to leave, Davidson asked one final question. "Jamal, how do you feel about your competition tomorrow?" For the first time since the ordeal began, Jamal smiled broadly. "Honestly, after everything that's happened, presenting my project to the judges doesn't seem scary at all." The Los Angeles Convention Center buzzed with activity as hundreds of young scientists from across the country set up their projects for the National Youth Science Competition. Colorful displays lined the massive exhibition hall, each representing months of research, experimentation, and innovation. Jamal stood before his table, carefully arranging his atmospheric analyzer and the accompanying data visualizations. Despite the events of the previous day, or perhaps because of them, his hands were steady, his focus sharp. Dr. Wilson watched from a distance, allowing his son this moment of independence. After yesterday's ordeal, he'd offered to stay home, but Jamal had insisted he come. "You helped build this, Dad," he'd said. "You should be here to see it judged." As Jamal made final adjustments to his display, Dr. Elaine Foster, the competition's director, approached with a warm smile. A respected meteorologist with silver hair and kind eyes, she had followed the news of Jamal's experience with growing concern. "Jamal Wilson," she said, extending her hand. "It's an honor to have you here. Your journey to this competition has been more challenging than most." "Thank you, Dr. Foster," Jamal replied, shaking her hand firmly. "I'm just glad I made it." "As are we," she assured him. "Your project has generated quite a bit of interest. The judges are particularly looking forward to seeing your presentation." As she moved on to greet other competitors, Jamal noticed the subtle glances and whispers from those around him. Word had spread. He was no longer just another competitor. He was the boy from the news, the one whose invention had been mistaken for a threat, the one whose father had grounded an airline in response. The attention might have overwhelmed him just days ago, but now Jamal drew strength from it. His father had shown him that standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, was its own kind of courage. Now it was his turn to show what he could do. The judging began at precisely 9:00 a.m. Distinguished scientists moved methodically through the hall, evaluating projects based on innovation methodology, presentation, and potential impact. When they reached Jamal's table, a small crowd had already gathered nearby, curious about both the young scientist and his now famous device. Dr. Samuel Taylor, a renowned atmospheric scientist with the National Weather Service, led the judging panel for Jamal's category. At 65, with a shock of white hair and penetrating blue eyes, he had a reputation for tough but fair evaluations. "Mr. Wilson," he began formally, "please explain your project." Jamal took a deep breath, then launched into his presentation with newfound confidence. The Wilson Atmospheric Analyzer addresses a critical gap in meteorological monitoring, he explained, gesturing to his device. Professional weather stations can cost tens of thousands of dollars, putting them out of reach for many communities, particularly those in developing regions or economically disadvantaged areas. He continued detailing the technical specifications, the innovative calibration methods that allowed inexpensive sensors to provide reliable data, and the custom software he'd written to analyze the readings. "What makes this truly different," Jamal explained, "is its accessibility. The entire system costs under $200 to build, uses open-source software, and can be assembled with basic technical skills. This democratizes weather data, giving vulnerable communities the tools to monitor their own environments." The judges asked pointed questions about calibration accuracy, power consumption, and data validation. Jamal answered each one with precision, occasionally referencing the extensive testing data he'd collected over 6 months of development. When the technical questions concluded, Dr. Taylor looked at Jamal for a long moment, then spoke in a voice loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "Mr. Wilson, I feel I must address something before continuing," he said gravely. "What happened to you yesterday was an embarrassment to aviation and to science. Those who mistook your innovation for a threat demonstrated not only bias, but a fundamental lack of scientific literacy." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers as Dr. Taylor continued. "However, your project is not here to be judged on news headlines. It's here to be judged on its merits, and my colleagues and I," he gestured to the other judges, "are very interested in your data logging protocol, specifically your method for insulating the Raspberry Pi against rapid temperature changes at altitude." It was as if a switch had been flipped. The validation from this respected scientist, a giant in the field, was a surge of pure adrenaline. Jamal's fear vanished, replaced by the passion he felt for his work. For 20 minutes, he didn't just present, he taught. He explained how he'd written a custom script to self-correct sensor drift, how he'd used a small, repurposed thermal pack to maintain the battery's integrity in varying conditions, and how the entire system was designed to be rebuilt by anyone with basic technical skills. The goal, Jamal said, his voice ringing with hard-earned confidence, isn't just to collect data. It's to make this technology accessible. A school in a rural area, a village in a developing country, they could build this. They could launch their own weather monitors and get data that could help their farmers or prepare them for storms. Science shouldn't just be for the people who can afford it. It should be for everyone. When he finished, there was a long silence. Jamal worried he'd gone too far, been too passionate. Then Dr. Taylor began to clap slowly, deliberately. The other judges joined in, and within seconds the entire section of the exhibition hall was applauding. Jamal looked at his father, who stood at the back of the crowd with tears in his eyes, pride evident in every line of his face. The rest of the day passed in a blur of additional judging conversations with other competitors and interviews with science publications that had caught wind of both his project and his story. By the time the judging concluded, Jamal was exhausted but exhilarated. That evening at the awards ceremony, tension filled the grand ballroom as hundreds of young scientists and their families awaited the results. When Dr. Foster took the stage to announce the winners, Jamal sat straight in his chair, his father's hand resting supportively on his shoulder. The grand prize for innovation with social impact. Dr. Foster announced, goes to Jamal Wilson for the Wilson Atmospheric Analyzer. The ballroom erupted in applause as Jamal made his way to the stage, stunned and elated. Dr. Foster presented him with a large trophy and announced that the prize included a $50,000 college scholarship and a prestigious summer internship with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. As Jamal accepted the trophy, he caught sight of his father in the audience applauding with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. In that moment, all the humiliation and fear of the previous day seemed distant, overshadowed by the pure joy of recognition, not just of his project, but of his potential. The golden trophy caught the light as Jamal held it carefully still, hardly believing it was real. Around him, the grand ballroom of the Los Angeles Convention Center buzzed with conversation and congratulations, but he felt strangely calm at the center of the storm. Dr. Samuel Taylor approached, extending his hand. "Remarkable work, young man. Truly remarkable." "Thank you, sir," Jamal replied, shaking the renowned scientist's hand firmly. "I'd like to discuss potential applications for your device in our climate monitoring network." Dr. Taylor continued, "Your approach to low-cost, high-accuracy sensing could revolutionize how we collect data in underserved regions." Before Jamal could respond, another figure joined them. Dr. Miranda Patel from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. "Mr. Wilson," she said warmly, "I'm looking forward to having you join us this summer. Your internship can start as early as June if that works for your schedule." Jamal nodded enthusiastically. "That would be amazing. Thank you." As the NASA scientist moved on to speak with other winners, Jamal found himself surrounded by fellow competitors, all eager to discuss his project and inevitably the events that had preceded the competition. "Is it true your dad grounded an entire airline?" asked one wide-eyed boy. "Did they really think your weather device was dangerous?" questioned another. Jamal answered their questions patiently, neither downplaying the discrimination he'd faced, nor allowing it to overshadow his scientific achievement. His father had taught him to address injustice directly, but to never let it define him. Speaking of his father, Jamal scanned the room, finally spotting Dr. Wilson in deep conversation with Dr. Foster and several other competition officials. The pride on his father's face was unmistakable even from across the crowded ballroom. As the evening progressed, Jamal found a moment of relative quiet near the refreshment table. A reporter from Scientific American approached, recorder in hand. "Jamal, your story has captivated the scientific community," she began. "What would you like people to take away from your experience?" Jamal considered the question carefully. "I want people to see that innovation can come from anywhere, from anyone. And I want them to understand that when we let fear and prejudice guide our judgments, we risk losing valuable contributions to science." "And what about your device? Where do you see it going from here?" A smile spread across Jamal's face. "Everywhere. That's the whole point. I'm already working on refining the design to make it even easier to build. My goal is to create detailed instructions and open-source software so schools and communities around the world can build their own atmospheric analyzers." As the reporter thanked him and moved on, Jamal felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find his father standing there, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Dad," Jamal asked, suddenly concerned, "are you okay?" Dr. Wilson smiled, pulling his son into a tight embrace. "More than okay. I'm proud of you, Jamal. So incredibly proud." Jamal hugged his father back, feeling the strength in those arms that had always supported him, always protected him, always pushed him to be his best self. When they separated, Dr. Wilson held his son at arm's length, looking him in the eyes. "You know what impressed me most today? Not the trophy, not the scholarship, though those are wonderful achievements. What impressed me most was how you carried yourself. You didn't let yesterday's injustice dim your light. You shone even brighter because of it." "I learned from the best," Jamal replied simply. The sound of tapping on glass interrupted their moment. Dr. Foster was calling for attention, preparing to close the evening's festivities. "Before we conclude," she announced, "I have an additional announcement. The National Youth Science Foundation, in partnership with the American Meteorological Society, is establishing a new initiative inspired by one of our winners tonight. The Accessible Science Program will provide resources and support for young innovators developing low-cost scientific instruments for underserved communities." She gestured toward Jamal. "Mr. Wilson's project exemplifies what we hope to achieve, democratizing access to scientific tools and data. We invite him to serve as the program's first youth advisor." The ballroom erupted in applause once more as Jamal stood overwhelmed by this unexpected honor. Later, as they left the convention center, trophy carefully packed in its case, Jamal looked up at the night sky, clear and star-filled above the city lights. "You know what's funny, Dad?" he said quietly. "What's that, son?" "Yesterday was probably the worst day of my life. Today might be the best, and they're connected, like they couldn't have happened without each other." Dr. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "Life works like that sometimes. Our greatest challenges often lead to our greatest triumphs, if we have the courage to push through them." As they walked to their hotel, Jamal carrying his trophy and Dr. Wilson with his arm around his son's shoulders, they were unaware of the broader changes their experience had already set in motion. Changes that would ripple through aviation education and beyond in the days and months to come. 6 months after the incident that grounded Atlantic Global Airlines, Catherine Vickers sat in the back row of a training room at the company's headquarters, barely recognizing the airline she had worked for over 2 decades. The instructor at the front, a specialist in objective security assessment, was walking the class through the newly implemented Wilson Protocol, a comprehensive framework for evaluating potential security concerns based on specific observable criteria rather than subjective impressions. The key principle the instructor explained is separating observation from interpretation. You observe a passenger with an unfamiliar electronic device. That's data. Interpreting that device as suspicious because of who is carrying it, that's bias. Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her seat. After a lengthy investigation, she had been given a choice termination or comprehensive retraining, followed by a probationary period in a ground position. Pride had almost led her to choose termination, but financial reality had pushed her toward the latter option. The humiliation of these past months had been nearly unbearable. Her name had become synonymous with the incident mentioned in training materials as a cautionary example. Some former colleagues avoided her entirely, while others treated her with a pitying kindness that was somehow worse. Yet something unexpected had begun to happen during the required diversity workshops and bias training sessions. Catherine had started to see, truly see, the patterns in her own behavior that had led to that fateful day. The assumptions she made, the differential treatment she provided without even realizing it. It wasn't a comfortable realization, but it was a necessary one. Across the country, Miguel Ramirez was experiencing a very different transformation. His decision to document discriminatory incidents and ultimately share that information had initially branded him a whistleblower, respected by some, resented by others. Now, however, he found himself in a new role, training supervisor for equitable passenger experience, created as part of Atlantic Global's comprehensive reforms. His experience on the front lines, combined with his commitment to fair treatment, made him uniquely qualified to help rebuild the airline's approach to passenger interactions. The goal isn't perfection, Miguel explained to a group of new flight attendants. We all have biases. The goal is awareness, recognizing when those biases might be influencing our judgment and having systems in place to correct for them. Meanwhile, in his corner office at corporate headquarters, Robert Davidson was reviewing the quarterly reports with a mixture of relief and lingering concern. The airline had survived what could have been an extinction-level event. After implementing all required changes and passing a rigorous FAA review, Atlantic Global had resumed operations within 2 weeks of the initial grounding. The financial hit had been substantial, over $75 million in direct costs and incalculable damage to their reputation. Yet the long-term indicators were surprisingly positive. Customer satisfaction scores after an initial dip were now higher than pre-incident levels. Employee retention had improved. Even their safety metrics showed enhancement, validating Dr. Wilson's assertion that objective assessment improved overall security effectiveness. Most surprising to Davidson was his own transformation. What had begun as a crisis management exercise, doing whatever was necessary to get planes back in the air and minimize financial damage, had evolved into a genuine commitment to organizational change. He had personally participated in the same training sessions required of frontline staff, sitting alongside flight attendants and gate agents. He had met with community leaders and industry experts, and perhaps most significantly, he had begun to understand that the standard operating procedures he had defended for years had contained hidden flaws that affected both safety and equity. "It's not about being politically correct," he told his executive team during their monthly meeting. "It's about being accurate. When we allow bias to cloud our judgment, we make bad decisions. Bad for our passengers, bad for our employees, and ultimately bad for our business." Laura Bennett, whose reporting had helped catalyze the Atlantic Global reforms, had expanded her investigation into a major series on discrimination in transportation. Her work had earned a Pulitzer nomination and sparked similar reviews at other airlines, train companies, and bus lines. What happened to Jamal Wilson wasn't an isolated incident, she wrote in her concluding piece. It was a visible manifestation of an invisible reality faced by thousands of travelers every day. The difference was that Jamal had an advocate with the power to demand accountability. The question now is, how do we extend that accountability to protect everyone, regardless of who their father happens to be? Back in the training room, Catherine watched as the instructor demonstrated the new assessment protocol using real-world examples. When he pulled up an image of a device strikingly similar to Jamal's atmospheric analyzer, she felt her face flush with remembered shame. "This is a legitimate scientific instrument," the instructor explained. "But it was flagged as suspicious on 3 separate occasions in the past year because the individuals carrying it didn't fit someone's mental image of scientist." Catherine forced herself to look at the image to confront her mistake directly. 6 months ago, she would have defended her actions, insisting she was just being cautious, following her instincts, putting safety first. Now she saw things differently. Her instincts had been shaped by unchecked assumptions. Her concept of safety had been filtered through a lens of bias, and a young scientist had nearly paid the price for her failure to distinguish between observation and interpretation. As the training session ended, Catherine remained seated while others filed out. The instructor noticed her hesitation and approached. "Ms. Vickers, was there something you wanted to discuss?" She nodded slowly. "I've been going through these trainings for months now, and I understand the protocols. But I keep coming back to one question. How do I make this right? Not just follow new procedures, but actually make amends for what happened." The instructor considered her question thoughtfully. "That's beyond the scope of our training program," he admitted. "But the fact that you're asking might be the most important step." Catherine nodded, gathering her materials. Maybe there was no way to erase what she'd done, but perhaps there was still a path forward. Not to forget the past, but to learn from it, to use it as a foundation for different choices in the future. As she left the training room, she passed a large poster displaying Atlantic Global's new corporate values. At the top of the list, "We see people, not categories. We assess situations, not appearances. We create safety through knowledge, not assumptions." Words alone couldn't change an organization, but they were a start. And for now, that would have to be enough. 1 year after winning the National Youth Science Competition, Jamal Wilson stood before a very different audience. The congressional hearing room buzzed with anticipation as lawmakers, industry representatives, and media personnel awaited his testimony. At 15, Jamal had grown taller, his voice deeper, but his eyes still held the same intelligence and determination. He adjusted the microphone and began to speak. "Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today regarding scientific innovation and equitable treatment in transportation safety. My name is Jamal Wilson, and last year I experienced firsthand how bias can impede both." The hearing, titled "Balancing Security and Innovation Lessons from the Atlantic Global Incident," had been convened to evaluate the impact of the reforms implemented following Jamal's experience, and to consider whether similar measures should be mandated across the transportation industry. Dr. Wilson sat proudly in the row behind his son, watching as Jamal articulated the complex interplay between security concerns, technological understanding, and implicit bias. His son had always been brilliant, but the past year had added a new dimension to that brilliance, a maturity and purpose forged through adversity. The Wilson atmospheric analyzer, which was mistaken for a threat, Jamal continued gesturing to the device now displayed on a table beside him, has since been developed into a commercial product available to schools and communities worldwide for just $75 per unit. Over 3,000 units are currently in use across 27 countries, providing critical meteorological data to communities that previously lacked access. He paused, looking directly at the committee members. But none of this would have been possible if my father hadn't been in a position to advocate for me. Most young inventors don't have that advantage. Most people facing discrimination don't have the power to ground an airline until they're treated fairly. The room was silent as his words sank in. Jamal's story had become more than a news cycle. It had become a catalyst for examining how prejudice could stifle innovation, particularly among young people of color. Following the hearing, the Jamal Wilson Scholarship for Minority Students in STEM was officially announced, funded by a coalition of technology companies and scientific organizations. The scholarship would provide financial support and mentorship to promising young scientists from underrepresented communities. Meanwhile, Atlantic Global Airlines had undergone a remarkable transformation. After implementing the Wilson Protocol and related reforms, they had emerged as industry leaders in equitable security practices. What had begun as a crisis response had evolved into a competitive advantage, with customer satisfaction scores rising as incidents of discriminatory treatment plummeted. Robert Davidson, speaking at an industry conference, summarized the shift. "We learned the hard way that bias isn't just a social issue, it's a business liability. When subjective judgment replaces objective assessment, you don't enhance security, you compromise it." The Atlantic Global case study was now taught in business schools nationwide as an example of how a corporate culture could be fundamentally reshaped in response to crisis. The airline's comprehensive approach, retraining staff at all levels, revising assessment protocols, implementing accountability mechanisms, and creating pathways for reporting concerns, had become a model for organizations far beyond the aviation industry. Back in New York, Mateo Gonzalez was witnessing the ripple effects of Jamal's story in his own community. The retired physics teacher had started a science program at his former school, using the Wilson Atmospheric Analyzer as a centerpiece of the curriculum. Students who had never seen themselves as scientists were building their own devices, collecting real environmental data, and developing a passion for inquiry. What happened to Jamal could have extinguished a bright scientific mind, Mateo told a visitor observing the program. Instead, it ignited hundreds more. These students see themselves in him. In his innovation, yes, but also in his resilience. The program had attracted funding from major tech companies and environmental organizations, allowing it to expand to additional schools in predominantly minority neighborhoods. Students who completed the program became eligible for internships and college scholarships, creating a pipeline of diverse talent into scientific fields. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Jamal's summer internship had evolved into an ongoing advisory role. His perspective as both a young innovator and someone who had faced barriers to participation proved invaluable as the organization developed outreach initiatives for underrepresented youth. The next generation of scientific breakthroughs won't come just from traditional pathways, Jamal explained during a panel discussion at the laboratory. They'll come from people who see problems differently because they've experienced different challenges. His atmospheric analyzer had continued to evolve as well. The latest version included enhancements suggested by users worldwide. Schools in rural India, community organizations in South Africa, environmental monitoring groups in flood-prone regions of Bangladesh. What had begun as one teenager's science project had become a global collaboration democratizing access to environmental data that could save lives and livelihoods. As for Catherine Vickers, her journey had taken yet another unexpected turn. After completing her retraining and probationary period, she had requested a transfer to Atlantic Global's Community Outreach Division. There, she now worked with schools and youth organizations, helping young people navigate air travel, particularly those traveling alone or carrying science projects to competitions. It wasn't redemption exactly. The harm she had caused couldn't be erased, but it was a form of atonement, using her experience to prevent others from making the same mistakes and to ensure that young travelers, especially those from minority backgrounds, had a positive experience. One afternoon, while conducting a workshop at a predominantly black middle school in Brooklyn, Catherine noticed a quiet boy in the back row working on what appeared to be a homemade electronic device. "What are you building?" she asked, approaching his desk. The boy looked up warily. "It's a soil moisture sensor for my mom's community garden," he explained. "It helps us know when to water each section." Catherine nodded, genuinely interested. That's impressive engineering. Are you planning to be a scientist? Maybe, the boy replied. My science teacher showed us a video about Jamal Wilson. He made something that helps people and didn't let anyone stop him even when they tried. Catherine felt the familiar sting of shame, but pushed through it. He's an excellent role model, she said sincerely, and I think your project shows real promise too. The boy smiled tentatively, and Catherine realized that this, encouraging the next generation of innovators rather than suspecting them, was perhaps the most meaningful work she had ever done. Across the country and beyond the story of a 14-year-old scientist, his atmospheric analyzer and the airline that tried to treat him as a threat continued to inspire change, in aviation, in education, and in the countless individual interactions where bias could either be challenged or reinforced. It wasn't a perfect transformation. Discrimination hadn't been eliminated, but a conversation had been started. Assumptions had been questioned and systems had been redesigned to promote equitable treatment. And for now, that was a legacy worth building upon. The evening air was cool on the hotel balcony overlooking Los Angeles, the city lights stretching to the horizon like earthbound stars. Jamal and his father stood side by side at the railing, a comfortable silence between them as they reflected on the congressional hearing earlier that day. You did well, Dr. Wilson said, finally pride evident in his voice. You spoke with clarity and purpose, made your points without sounding bitter or accusatory. Jamal smiled. I learned from watching you. You never lost your cool that day at the airport, even when you had every right to. Oh, I was angry, Dr. Wilson admitted. Furious, actually. But I learned long ago that anger can be fuel for change, or it can be a fire that burns you up. The trick is channeling it productively. They fell quiet again, watching a plane's lights trace a path across the night sky. So much had changed in the year since that fateful flight, not just in their lives, but in the systems and institutions their experience had helped to reshape. Dad, Jamal said thoughtfully, do you ever think about how different things might have been if you weren't who you are? If you didn't have the authority to ground an airline? Dr. Wilson nodded slowly. All the time. That's what drives me to keep pushing for structural change. The response to what happened to you shouldn't depend on your father being able to invoke emergency protocols. It's strange, Jamal mused. Something so awful led to so much good. The scholarship program, the commercial version of my analyzer, the changes at Atlantic Global and other airlines. Life's turning points often come disguised as disasters, Dr. Wilson replied. What matters is how we respond to them. He turned to face his son fully. You know what I'm most proud of? Not that you won that competition or testified before Congress or got that NASA position. I'm proud of how you've handled all this attention without letting it define you. You're still focused on the science, on making a difference through your work. Jamal nodded understanding. The device was never about winning awards or getting recognition. It was about solving a problem, making weather data accessible to people who need it but can't afford expensive equipment. Exactly, Dr. Wilson agreed. And that purpose has only gotten clearer through all of this. They returned to watching the city lights, each lost in their own thoughts for a moment. Then Dr. Wilson spoke again, his voice softer but filled with conviction. Jamal, what Catherine Vickers and Atlantic Global did that day. They didn't ground you. They just cleared you for a much, much higher altitude. Jamal smiled at the aviation metaphor. It was fitting coming from his father, and it captured something essential about their journey. What had begun as discrimination had transformed into determination, obstacles into opportunities. You know what's funny, Jamal said. When I look back on that day now, I don't feel angry anymore. I just feel purposeful. Like now I understand exactly what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. Dr. Wilson put his arm around his son's shoulders. And what's that? Breaking barriers, Jamal replied simply. not just for myself but for everyone who comes after me. Using science to solve problems and bridge divides. Creating tools that help people regardless of where they live or what resources they have. As they stood there together, father and son, looking out over the city, the significance of their journey settled around them like a mantle. They had faced injustice and had not merely survived it. They had transformed it into something meaningful, something lasting. The incident at JFK wasn't the end of Jamal's story. It wasn't even the most important chapter. It was simply turbulence before the ascent, a difficult moment that had ultimately propelled him toward his true purpose. And as Jamal Wilson looked toward the future, he saw not limitations, but possibilities, not barriers, but horizons waiting to be explored. The sky wasn't just a place he'd been prevented from flying through on that fateful day. It was a frontier his mind had already begun to transcend. This story reminds us all that when bias and ignorance attempt to clip the wings of innovation, the outcome isn't always what those in power expect. Sometimes the very people they try to ground end up soaring higher than anyone imagined possible. If you found Jamal's story inspiring, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and triumph against the odds. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes our greatest setbacks lead to our most extraordinary breakthroughs. Remember, your support helps us continue sharing these important stories that need to be told.